¿Ahora estamos grabando?
Ok, ahora sí ya estamos al aire.
Perfecto. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas todos al Congreso Nacional de Geografía del año 2021, que está organizado por la Universidad Católica de Valparaíso, en colaboración con las distintas casas de estudio de todo Chile. Tenemos la presencia también de colaboradores y amigos internacionales, y tengo el gran placer de presentar esta conferencia magistral de la profesora Harriet Hawkins. Harriet es una colaboradora de nuestro proyecto GeoHumanidades. Como estábamos comentando recién, ella estaba programada para visitarnos en el congreso que ocurrió en Temuco bajo la dirección del profesor Fernando Peña, y lamentablemente no pudo ocurrir. Después vino la pandemia y ella no alcanzó a venir. Así es que ahora estamos cumpliendo este anhelado situación de que tenemos a Harriet como keynote speaker en esta sesión. La profesora Harriet Hawkins es fundadora del Centro de GeoHumanidades de Royal Holloway en la Universidad de Londres y directora de la Asociación de Formación Doctoral AHRC. Es miembro del panel de expertos en geografía y estudios ambientales del Reino Unido, y su investigación se concentra en el cruce entre geografía, arte, la creatividad, la estética y la imaginación. Desarrolla actualmente un proyecto denominado Think Deep, que explora las prácticas de investigación artístico-geográfica en los espacios subterráneos. Cómo imaginar ciudades subterráneas, explorar complejidades de la extracción, que nosotros aquí en Chile tan bien como conocemos a propósito de nuestra tradición minera, y el patrimonio de los paisajes subterráneos en todo el mundo. Tiene mucha relación con los enfoques de las geohumanidades, uniendo la práctica de la investigación geográfica con tres problemas claves del subsuelo, que son los retos de entender y comprender los distintos aspectos que ocurren en el subsuelo, las complejas y conflictivas imaginaciones que tenemos de los espacios subterráneos, y las especulaciones que por lo tanto se generan a raíz de estos imaginarios. Esperamos que esta sesión sea de interés para la comunidad geográfica y sus disciplinas afines, y sin ir más allá, voy a dejar con ustedes a la profesora Harriet Hawkins, que, insisto, con 2 años de desfase nos visita en esta sesión virtual del Congreso de Geografía. Bienvenida, Harriet, a nuestra comunidad geográfica.
Thank you very much. I've lost the end of the translation, so I wasn't entirely clear the whole of what you said, but thank you very, very much for the part that I could understand. So thank you, and thank you very much for this wonderful invitation. I'm incredibly honored to be talking to you all. Should I now start my presentation? Is that what I should do? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint. Sorry, I'm just working out how to make this share because it's currently struggling to make it work. Sorry about this. Sorry, for some reason, my screen sharing is not working, so I am just going to continue to work out exactly what I'm going to do. I'm very sorry. I'll be with you very shortly.
Entre tanto, no sé si Fernando Peña, estás conectado. Tú ibas a decir unas palabras y no te cortamos.
No hay problema, Andrés. Adelante, por favor. Solamente felicitarlos y fuerza con la actividad.
Muchas gracias.
Apologies, usually it just lets me share straight away, but for some reason it is telling me it cannot access anything. So I'll be with you in 1 second. Okay. It's telling me to access my screen. It's going to need me to, because it's recording, I'm going to need to quit Zoom and then come back into the meeting in order to be able to share my screen. Is that okay if I do that now?
Yes, if it doesn't work, we will present for you the PowerPoint.
Okay, brilliant. I'm hoping this will work, but I'm very sorry about this. I think it's because it's doing a recording and my computer's being quite temperamental, so I'm very sorry.
Harriet nos comenta que su computador es un poco porfiado, entonces se salió de la sesión para volver a ingresar enseguida y de esa forma va a poder presentar. Lamentamos los inconvenientes técnicos, pero estamos aquí atentos.
Andrés, por mientras se puede invitar a los colegas a visitar el sitio web de GeoHumanidades que patrocina esta charla.
Aprovechamos de invitarles, como dice Pablo, a visitar el sitio www.biogeoart.cl. También les dejamos invitados para la sesión de las 2:30 de Geografías Creativas y para la muestra de videos que va a ocurrir, Pablo, a las 6 de la tarde, si no me equivoco.
Sí, 6 de la tarde.
Excelente.
Is it okay if I try screen sharing again?
Does it work now?
Ah, yes, it does. Brilliant.
Brilliant.
Sorry about that, everybody. That's not very helpful of me.
That's perfect.
Wonderful. So I'm going to start again. Many thanks, everybody, for your patience. Andreas, did you want to say anything before I start?
I just want to say that it's looking very good.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's always useful to know in these Zoom worlds. Thank you very, very much for that introduction, Andreas, and thank you all very much for your patience while I sort out my technical issues. I'm incredibly honoured to be here presenting to you all, and I'm just very sad that I haven't been able to come over in person over the last few years. Obviously, we've all been through an incredibly difficult time, and I really, really hope that in the future we'll be able to intersect either in your country or in mine. It's also been a real honour and a privilege to get to know the work of Andreas and his collaborators over the last few years and the work they've been doing in their BioGeoArt project. It's been incredibly inspiring for people like myself who are trying to pull together large teams of our own work. So many thanks for the work that you're all doing and being so very inspiring. So my talk today is about creative geographies, advances and challenges. Who doesn't want to be creative? To be creative sounds like a really wonderful thing. It conjures the excitement and distinction of imaginations of poetry, art, or literature and music. Or perhaps it suggests a sense of being experimental and innovative, of pushing at boundaries and thinking outside of the box. Or maybe just an ordinary, everyday kind of creativity, useful, notable, and enabling, how we get through the day. Whatever it means, geographers are clearly interested in being creative. Of course, the entanglement of geographical knowledge and creative practices is centuries, if not millennia long. We might think, for example, of the implication of artistic practices within Western colonial exploration. Yet in the past decade, we've seen the confirmation of Divya Toiler-Kelly's observation in her 2012 paper that collaborations between geography, art, and visual culture are almost a new orthodoxy of research. Indeed, alongside long practiced visual methods, including photography, drawing, video making, and others, we find geographers turning to a diverse range of creative practices. Working alone and in collaboration, geographers have been exploring dance, poetry, theatre, taxidermy, singing, music making, graffiti, diverse sound art practices, neon lighting, and geographics or comic book making. And together, these different methods, of which some of the examples on the slide are just a few, have explored questions as diverse as how do we know place? How can we sense environmental change? How can we make research with communities? And how can we engage publics with difficult questions? Indeed, so diverse are the intersections now between geography and creative practice that this is a field beyond the capacity of anyone to survey. This is further compounded by the interest in creative practices beyond geography's always blurry subdisciplinary boundaries. Indeed, we find these practices within participatory geographies, political, economic, and social geography, and even, of course, in physical geography. Now, in the time I've got with you today, I want to do two things. Firstly, I want to reflect a little further on what creative geographies are. This will also serve as a sort of introduction for those of you who may be new to this way of thinking and working. Secondly, I want to take 3 words and spend a bit of time thinking about how each word both advances and challenges creative geographies. These words are mediums, politics, and research. And finally, as a sort of conclusion, I'm going to turn to the word creative itself. In each case, as I will explore, each of these ideas enables an exploration of both the advances made in and by creative geographers, but also the challenges we face in doing those creative geographies. So firstly then, what are creative geographies and how do I think they've evolved? So creative geographies, experimental geographies, creative collaborative interdisciplinary research, artful geographies, the geo-artist, creative geographical research methods, research creation, artistic research, practice-led or practice-based research. There are a growing number of names and neologisms that have emerged to capture and sort the rich relations between creative practice and geographical research within and beyond cultural geography. Some of these ideas express allegiances to philosophical or theoretical inheritances, such as the legacy of the ideas research creation owe to the work of theorists such as Alfred North Whitehead, Deleuze and Guattari, Isabel Stengers, and others. For others working in this field, such as those around practice-based research, including doctoral scholarship, these are shaped by debates from within artistic disciplines, enabling students to do diverse practice-based or practice-led PhDs, where their creative practices counts within their doctoral work. A third group of these ideas relate to geographical discussions around the ideas of creativity and experiment, art and aesthetics within the discipline of geography, exploring critically these ideas and what it means for geographers to not just study the artistic and creative practices of others, but use them within their own research. Now, in my reflections today, I'm perhaps less interested in exactly what we call some of these practices than I am in exploring the diverse relationships that have emerged between geography and creativity. And I want to think of these in terms of 2 ideas. On the one hand, there is the nascent creative turn across social science disciplines such as geography, sociology, and archaeology, within which creative practices like drawing, photography, storytelling, and theatre have emerged as research methods. These offer, for example, forms of sensory ethnography, turning attention to sensory and emotional experiences in the world, or enabling participatory actions research co-production of scientific knowledge with diverse stakeholders and local publics. This is not without some controversy. Some scholars dismiss the possibilities of creative practices. They argue, empirically weak, focused on applied rather than basic research, or at best, are valuable forms of public engagement. Others, of course, find creative research methods to be an exciting frontier. On the other hand, though, the second of these two ideas is the research turn amongst creative practice-based disciplines such as fine art, creative writing, architecture, and design. In the research turn, creative practices extend beyond just being a research method that can be done by anyone with a little bit of training, to instead being a highly skilled endeavour that situates creative practice as working right across the research process, from changing the way we conceive of our projects, to the kinds of research we produce during them, to the kinds of outputs we use. So I want to offer a few examples to animate these two ideas. Firstly, the creative turn. So a colleague of mine at Royal Holloway, Catherine Brookell, has done long-standing research on women in Cambodia and their everyday experiences, from that of domestic violence to enforced displacement of those women working in brick kilns. The focus of Catherine's work is often visual methods. As part of her research, Catherine ran a series of video workshops with women and their families, exploring the very difficult emotional experiences of domestic violence, and especially in a religious context in which beliefs locate women firmly in the home. Of course, creative practices have long been a part of participatory scholars' research practices, where video, photography, theatre making, and drawing offer the means to account for voices beyond the academy and to value other ways of knowing. In Catherine's work, the voices that she records on the video and the stories that become acted out are those of women whose experiences are often overlooked in the process of legal discussions about domestic violence, but also where their lived experiences are undervalued or hard for Western researchers so distant from their culture to get at. Catherine's more recent project, though, on brick kilns, in collaboration with a series of other scholars and the photographer Thomas Cristoforetti, however, has used creative practices in a rather different way. Thomas has created a series of incredibly powerful images, some of which you can see here, that have been part of both the selection of the research sites, the engagement of the participants within the research, as well as being part of photo essays, exhibitions, and policy reports to large bodies like the UN. In this context, then, these photographs are both a crucial part of the research practice, but also help animate the findings for audiences beyond the academy, bringing these stories into films, into television programs, and into international newspaper and policy-making fora. And these images are incredibly important as part of that. We might reflect then on the biography of Catherine's involvement with these creative geographies. She started as an individual researcher who underwent some video training to use participatory visual methods as part of her research work, to work with her communities rather than on them. But then, as she got more used to using visual methods, she started to collaborate with a skilled creative practitioner, Thomas, who could use their creative methods within the research team's wider work. And of course, we know of many other examples where geographers have been part of the creation of large multidisciplinary teams. And obviously, Andreas's own project and that of his collaborators, BioGeoArt or GeoHumanidades, and the Creative Biogeographies project is a really wonderful example. And it's really influential in the way it's brought together geographers, artists, designers, architects, and others to address these questions of environmental concern. Now, of course, many of you in the audience will know far more about this project than I do, and of course have been involved with it at first hand. But I just wanted to take the time to note the incredibly important model this is offering for others of us interested in how it is you can draw together large teams of individuals, of scholars and of students and of creative practitioners into rich and diverse discussions with communities about the world's most pressing issues. So alongside geography's creative turn, we might also take account of what's been called the art world's research turn. And to discuss this a bit further, I want to reflect on the work of one of my PhD students and collaborators, Flora Parrott. Now, Flora is a sculptor and an installation artist whose work you can see on the slide here. And we've been working together on questions of caves in the underground for almost a decade now. For a project called Both Within and Without, Flora focused on 3 different cave sites: the Ice Cave on the Mer de Glace in Chamonix in France, a cave network in Germany, and Mother Shipton's Cave in North Yorkshire in England. Now, as an artist and someone who has an arts degree and arts background, she was interested to come and work in geography and do her doctoral research in geography because she felt she could use her practice as a way to think about some of the questions geographers had about engaging with the subsurface. She was interested in how her artistic practice might open up questions about the embodied exploration of caves, about the encounters with subsurface animals, including cave fish. She was particularly interested in these shared and different embodied experiences and the way caves decenter how we see to require us to feel, smell, and touch. Importantly, though, rather than position her research as somehow offering a more complete picture of of the cave and human and non-human experiences of these underworld environments, Flora and I have been interested in how her artistic practices enable us to explore what is unknown and unresolvable about the underground. So often when we do research, we look for methods that enable us to create a full, a richer, or a better picture of something. But also we might ask ourselves, how does creative practice-based research make space in our research questions for things that are not known, that are hard to know, or might even be beyond what humans can begin to understand? To close this section of my talk, I want to pause to note the challenge posed by the sheer diversity of creative geographies, and I've only included just a few here so far. These creative geographies enable really varied research questions. They're diverse in terms of the ways through which these creative geographies happen. It might be us as individual researchers learning new creative practices to use as part of our usual suite of research methods alongside interviews, for example. It might also be geographers collaborating with creative practitioners on individual research projects or working together as large research teams, asking and answering questions together. It might also be creative practitioners like Flora coming into geography departments and in doing so helping us to reshape the discipline and its research practices. For the rest of my time, I want to offer a few more examples by focusing on 3 words. And each of these words folds together both advances and challenges around creative geographies. And in doing so, lets us take account of some of the diversity of these practices. My first word is mediums. Mediums. When we talk about creative geographies, the risk is that we smear or rub together all the different forms and types of creative practices we might do, with little attention to the differences between them. If geography has long been spoken of as a visual discipline, and here are some of the kinds of exploration images that have long been part of the history of a particularly Western form of geography, a history of a discipline, of course, shaped by colonialism. As a visual discipline, these visual methods of photography, drawing, filmmaking, and most recently virtual reality have become key. But increasingly, geographers have embraced a rich range of methods, of mediums, and of different ways of making creative work. not least to explore how other creative practices, other mediums, might enable other ways of knowing, where questions of power perhaps work differently than they do in these exploration images. Working as poets, as dancers, as installation artists, as sculptors, as painters, and so on, some geographers identify with a single term: I am a sculptor, I'm a geoartist. Others thoroughly embrace what could be called a post-medium practice. In other words, perhaps they're guided by their research questions to select lots of different ways of working, depending upon the needs of the topic. But in the midst of all these different possibilities, this flowering of creative geographies to embrace many different ways of working, we risk perhaps losing the analytic precision of these mediums themselves. After all, if we take up different creative practices as part of our geographic research, we need to ask, what is it that these different mediums do? What do they let us do as researchers? What, for example, does using visual methods to picture things enable that sculpture making does not? What sorts of practices and ideas does something like dance do that practices like paintings don't? Even more precisely, what might representational painting enable us to do as researchers that drawing or abstract painting might do differently? To reflect on the mediums, on how we do our creative geographies then, is an important challenge. To elaborate on this, I want to turn to one project, Kangisa's work, Climates of Listening, which uses sound to foreground Indigenous Pacific arguments for and practices of self-determination in the face of rapid socio-ecological transformation. In doing so, aimed to help situate climate change as a continuation of ongoing colonial and racial violences, and centralize the need to expand narratives of vulnerability and resilience to center the resistance and autonomy of Indigenous Pacific communities. So Ame and her Indigenous collaborators used sound ethnographies to attune to different experiences, perspectives, and knowledge. She was keen to explore the ways that connections between people, ocean, and land might be explored differently through sound. Thinking through practices of sound art and listening to the environment as a means to know these different environments, but also not only listening as a researcher, but encouraging us as audiences to listen to land and seascapes, and to listen to the relationships between human and non-human landscapes. Climates of Listening develops a sophisticated theoretical understanding of the medium of sound. It asks us to think of sound as a medium for connection and disconnection. It also asks us to explore what silence might enable, what relational ideas might happen in the midst of practices of listening. When, Ame asks, is listening to land about being present, but when might it also be inappropriate to listen? How might silence be an act of resistance? But also, how too is refusing to listen properly, carefully, or well, whatever that might mean, a demonstration of power or an act of violence? I urge you to go and listen to Ame's work, for in their thinking, it is clear that what the medium of sound art enables for them as a researcher and for us as an audience is vital in terms of how it links the conceptual content of the research with the medium of sound that they are using. And I've put a link there, listening to Nauru, in the bottom corner of the slide, which will enable you to go and listen to some of Am's amazing work. So the word medium then enables us as creative geographers to celebrate the breadth of our practices beyond the sometimes challenging visual histories of geography as a discipline. But the idea of mediums also raises a challenge to creative geographies to ensure that we think hard about what these different mediums do and enable, why we might choose one set of creative practices over another set of practices to explore certain ideas. But also we need to ask ourselves as geographers, how do we bear in mind and educate ourselves to the really rich histories of all these creative practices? After all, many of us are not trained as artists or art historians. But perhaps just as we spend time as scholars learning different practices and methods, whether that's those of being in the archive or of participant observation or of interviews and ethnography, we should consider too investing time in learning the histories, legacies, and skills of different sorts of creative mediums. My second word then is politics. It was geography's, quote, untrammeled imbibing of cultural fizz and excitement, end quote, that caused many geographers in the 80s and 90s to express significant worries regarding the place of culture within geography and the cultural turn's relationships to politics, morals, and ethics. In a forgetful navigation of the material force of the geographical imagination, noted most famously by Edward Said, but also Derek Gregory, David Harvey, and others, the cultural turn was for its naysayers a wearisome parade of identity politics. And for those who really didn't like it, it was, at worst, an apolitical turn away from the substantial material on the ground politics of a geography that mattered in the world, in favour of imaginative whimsy, creative fun, and artistic pleasure. My intent here is not to continue the long drawn-out debates over the politics of the culture within geography, despite the ways these still haunt Western cultural geography today. Instead, I want to reflect on how cultural geographies might be firmly considered to engage with politics and how creative geographies can add to this. Of course, it would be remiss to start to talk about the politics of geography without pausing to note some of the challenges presented once again by the colonial inheritances of creative practices and their role within what Felix Driver has called geography militant, where painting and drawing were firmly part of a colonial will to know and hence to control. Most notably, of course, in the South Pacific, which we see examples of here, where the imperial force of the so-called tropical vision of empire was absolutely central, with creative practices and artists being significant in how this was propagated. Yet, of course, today, creative geographies are enrolled in all sorts of other kinds of politics, not least the important work of imagining a world to come. I've been really interested recently in the work of a collective group called Design Earth, and their project GeoStories, another architecture for the environment. In a series of books and exhibitions, Design Earth offer a series of inspiring and provocative architectural imaginations. The graphic narratives of these geostories narrate the pasts, presents, and possible futures of pressing issues, from on-Earth extraction to the problems of space debris. And they do so in locations from the Persian Gulf to the geostationary orbit 35,000 kilometers above Cotopaxi volcano in Ecuador. Now, Design Earth describe themselves as a collaborative organization. They're an architectural office which engages geography with the aim to open up a range of aesthetic and political concerns for architecture and urbanism. Their partners and creators are thoroughly interdisciplinary. They're scholars of architecture and geography based in the US, but they're also scholars of politics and aesthetics. Design Earth is clear that their compound, their new word, GeoStories, owes a lot of debt to Latour's desire for a common geostory for the world. For them, that understanding of a common geostory is about an active reimagination of a non-anthropocentric world, done here through new forms of architecture. They also, of course, note their debt to forms of speculative fiction and the resonance of their graphic geographies with the ideas of Donna Haraway and the writings of Ursula Le Guin and others. Theirs is a thoroughly political, if perhaps sometimes utopian and dystopian vision. They're keen to examine those locations underground, under the sea and under the ice, as well as those parts of the world and those areas off planet that are often overlooked or subject to the power and control of violent regimes. In their imagination of sometimes otherworldly futures, Design Earth asks us to reflect hard on the limits of our own imaginations, on what we might be able to make possible, but also what is at stake in imagining otherwise, and who gets to make and do these kinds of imaginings. I'm fascinated too in how we might, as geographers, build on some of these wonderful architectural fictions and think how we might bring them down to earth, how we might build them realistically. I'm keen, for example, in my current project, to think about how creative practices might offer the space for collaborative, collective futures that we imagine together with our local communities. What might it mean to draw together artists, architects, planners, engineers, and communities to imagine, design, and eventually bring about these new futures? That's a set of questions I'm keen to ask in the work I'm doing on the subsurface as a location for our urban futures. Of course, there are important questions here. Whose futures are we imagining? What kinds of futures are they? Can we imagine them together? What might it mean to think about futures that are about degrowth? To create futures where humans and non-humans can live together in ways other than those premised on destructive violence and resource exploitation? And what is the role of the creative in creative geographies to bring this about? As beguiling as all these promises of creative geographies are, as the possibilities of imagining new worlds might be, of opening up together speculative futures, we might do well, though, as well, to slow down, pause, and reflect further on the claims we make for our creative geographies. So often words like transformation are used, and I've been guilty of this myself. But transformation for whom, from what, to what? How does this transformation happen? What does it mean to claim the impacts of creative geographies as a transformatory one? I'm very persuaded by the work of scholars practitioners like Sarah DeLeo and her team, who are committed to feminist and post-colonial working. And they urge us that rather than getting carried away by the fetish and excitement of creativity, we need to continue to ask difficult questions. For who is this work being produced? Who benefits? Who is left out? How might we develop frameworks for critically examining creative arts and humanities ways of knowing and being? Focusing on what it means to work with Indigenous communities in Northern British Columbia, Sarah DeLeo and her team reflect on Western scholars who borrow or steal these Indigenous stories, retelling them in their own worlds. They consider the politics of imposing Western creative forms and modes onto other kinds of storytelling, and how this does its own kind of violence and forms its own mode of cultural extraction. In other words, they caution, we should remain vigilant and critically aware, ensuring that creative geographies don't become a parody of themselves, wholly corruptible, able to be put to use in exactly the opposite ways for which they were intended. To think then about the politics in the context of creative geographies is to have to hold together both the political potentials of these ways of working, but also to think of them as politically inflected knowledge-making practices in their own right, to appreciate their own politics, and then the need to guard against them becoming forms of cultural extraction. The final word I want to turn to is research. Richard Nagir, writing in the journal Gender, Place and Culture, observed, quote, "We need a radical rethinking of how we can remake knowledges and redistribute the right to theorize." Reflecting on her own practice around creative community storytelling and theatre making, she observes, quote, "The status of academic researchers as the true intellectual thinkers too often remains undisturbed, along with hierarchies that elevate theory, research, and academic knowledge production to a higher plane than questions of method, community-based dialogue, and sometimes non-conventional academic writing. I think we could add to her list of things that need to be rethought, creative geographies." There is still a tendency for some to dismiss creative geographies as not proper research, as soft options, as not real science, as applied or community research or community engagement, rather than doing actual research. This is, of course, particularly challenging for early career scholars trying to build their work. If they're using creative practices and the value of these are dismissed in the context of CVs, job applications, grants, and so on. I'm sure many of us have worked in geography departments or been in disciplinary contexts where creative geographies are appreciated for the entertainment value they offer, but sometimes seen as novelty rather than knowledge making. Whilst this is a challenge that needs to be overcome, I think it's precisely such a challenge because what creative geographies often do is ask us to reflect hard on what we need to understand by knowledge, how we think about, do, and value research. In short, then, what is interesting for me about creative geographies are how they force us as individuals and as a discipline to ask questions about the kind of knowledge we make and how we value it. One way in which creative geographies are often understood is as having a value downstream of research. In other words, fieldwork and analysis happens, and then creative geographies help disseminate the findings to our audiences. But of course, we know this is not the case. Instead, creative geographies not only have a place throughout the research process, but as such, they can fundamentally change that process. So participatory research around creative practices, like Catherine Brockel's video work, or Richard Nageer's theatre and storytelling practices, push us to make research with communities rather than on those communities. Whilst work like Derek McCormack's movement practices require us to ask what happens in the field. Do we go into the field with a set of research questions we're already framed to ask, or a recipe book of methods we already know how to use? What about if we spent time in the field and used creative practices to attune to it, to engage ourselves differently with the field, with our research interests emerging and evolving with the time spent there? To return to Flora Parrott's work, how might creative geographies offer less the final piece of an epistemological jigsaw, less, richer and fuller accounts of our fieldwork, than pointing us towards how we need to get comfortable with those fieldwork situations in which not knowing and the limits and edges of what humans can know, as well as the unknowable, are crucial. We might also reflect on how creative geographies bring with them the need to refigure the forms and spaces of our geographical outputs. Alongside our journal articles and monographs, we might think of how creative geographies produce books, exhibitions, plays, paintings, sculptures, performances, comic books, and so on. But importantly too, I think they're reshaping the spaces of our journals. Here, for example, is a piece of work by the artist Perdita Phillips, where her account of artistic practices of field walking exceeds the limits of words and images, and also is found performed on the page. The hand-drawn narrative that runs across the journal pages asks us to think about geographies of reading and writing differently. When I look at this squiggly line, I'm unsure. As a reader, do I follow the line first through the article and then go back and read the text? Or do I look at different chunks of the line as they appear on the page beneath the text and image? In this piece, then, it's not only the space of the page that gets reconfigured, but also the geographies of how, as readers, we consider it. To think then about creative geographies is to appreciate how they are advances, ask questions about the geographies of research, and how we do research as geographers. This poses sometimes profound questions about how we make knowledge as individuals, but also collectively as a discipline, about what the limits of that knowledge is, and about where we've perhaps come conservative and conventional, where we might open up and change, but where we stay fixed with our existing patterns. As such, creative geographies can be a bit of a breath of fresh air, requiring that we revisit and potentially rethink some of our accepted research conventions. But with such questionings too come challenges. Not everyone values creative geographies, and nor should they. Indeed, I think we sometimes need, as creative geographers, to do a better job of exploring and explaining how it is creative geographies work, what they do as forms of knowledge production, and why it is that geographers and others should care. To close then, one final word, the word creative itself. Is the word creative itself both one of creative geography's biggest benefits? After all, who isn't excited by the idea of being creative? It sounds innovative, edgy, cool, and interesting. But also, what if the very diversity of creativity is part of its own downfall? To be creative can mean those bounded senses of creative practice, art, poetry, dance, and so on, sometimes dismissed as high art, but it can also encompass the creative industries. Richard Florida the theorist famously controversially denoted a creative class, including not only creative practitioners, but also lawyers, teachers, programmers, and academics. For others, the fetish of creativity and the neoliberal politics of the creative industries align. Creative geographies thus becomes a form of extractive practice in which the academic industry extracts value from creative artists and makers, and where the potential richness and critical value of creativity as a set of ideas can become dumbed down, losing all critical and political possibility, a sort of creative art washing, like greenwashing. Creativity too can risk denoting a certain sort of high art practice, an exclusionary elite practice that overlooks the everyday ordinary creativities of just getting by in the world. Whether this be doing practices like cooking, hobbies like craft, or even innovating in the moment, like picking up a stool and using it to prop open a door, that in and of itself is a kind of instinctive creativity. As such, then, does the talk about creative geographies somehow suggest that all geographies not using creative arts practices are somehow uncreative, run-of-the-mill, perhaps a little dull? Of course, that's not what it suggests at all. But is that the implication if we ring-fencing something and call it creative geographies? Maybe then, in its richness, the idea of creative geographies has run its course. Is it now so baggy as to be no longer useful? Are its politics so concerning and so enfolded with a neoliberal economy, especially of our cities, as to be toxic? Yet it is perhaps this very tension between the richness of the mediums we can use, but the precision that each of the forms of creative practice demands, between the concerning politics of the idea, but also their potentiality for forging new research cultures and making new worlds. Perhaps it is this tension, this potential, that makes creative geographies so very, very beguiling. Thank you very much for your time.
Muchas gracias, Harriet, por la inspiradora presentación. Hay entre estos temas tenemos un mundo de subtemas en los cuales podríamos sumergirnos. Yo quisiera comentar brevemente acerca de esta distinción o esta pretensión de acercarnos al arte desde la geografía y el riesgo de que esto se transforme nuevamente en lo que tú mencionabas, una extracción. Y nosotros estamos luchando aquí permanentemente contra el extractivismo y el neoextractivismo. Entonces, plantear estas relaciones horizontales con otras disciplinas, y especialmente con las humanidades y con el arte, pasa a ser un tremendo desafío, puesto que tenemos que ser muy cautos en el sentido de no ir a extraer conocimientos, prácticas. Sobre todo muy sensible pasa a ser esto cuando trabajamos con comunidades originales, comunidades aborígenes, y nosotros transformamos este conocimiento en artículos científicos o en artículos para la comunidad científica. Nos vemos enfrentados a estas paradojas y a estos desafíos permanentemente, y eso lo planteo como un desafío, abriendo un poquito la discusión.
Thank you. I think it's a really important challenge and an incredibly important point, not least as so many of us work both with kind of creative communities who often, certainly in the UK, while many of the creative practitioners geographers work with will have academic positions, many don't. Many are precariously employed and work without kind of regular wages. And so there's, as well as the imbalance with the communities we work with, there's also the sorts of lots of different imbalances between a kind of academic community and an arts community. So working through how to navigate all those different forms of extraction is really, really important. And I think one of the things I'm excited about the possibility of is also what it means to really think hard about the way that geography has, over the history of itself as a discipline, thought of itself as a science and then opened up to think about kind of relationship of arts and humanities. And obviously much further back, geography, you know, certainly the stories of geography we tell ourselves in the Western world is one of an Enlightenment science that geography demands to be. And what does it mean to think through a sort of disciplinary hierarchy differently if we make open space to think through, exactly as you put it, these kind of horizontal relations?
Ciertamente, Harriet, muy inspirador el comentario y la presentación. Y Ulises, aquí está comentando también, no sé si quieres abrir tu micrófono, Ulises, tenemos espacio antes de la 1 para algunas consultas y comentarios.
Ok, muchas gracias, Andrés. Saludo a todos y todas, gracias por la oportunidad, muy interesante, como tú decías, inspiradora la charla. Realmente estuve pensando muchas cosas mientras se daba la exposición, y ahí yo puse una consulta que tiene que ver un poco, yo lo miraba lo que decía Harriet recién, en el sentido horizontal, academia-artistas. Para mí, como que hay una relación entre, digamos, en una relación horizontal, o no sé si horizontal, pero hay otras conexiones también que tienen que ver con el mundo político, más vertical, digamos, ¿cierto? Organizaciones de escalas mayores, y también con las comunidades, digamos, con las pequeñas escalas. Y ahí pensaba yo un poco la pregunta, ¿cuál es la relación entre estas geografías creativas y las comunidades? En el fondo, pues de alguna forma está la disputa, o nos presentaba Harriet, el posicionamiento de estas geografías en la lógica de la academia y la validación dentro de la academia. Pero yo pensaba, ¿cuál es el sentido? O sea, cómo esto nos ayudaba a que las comunidades se encuentren con los académicos para la construcción de sentidos y sensibilidades particulares. Eso no más largo para que... Eso, gracias.
Muchas gracias, Ulises, por el comentario. No sé si quieres comentar, Harriet.
That was a really fascinating and incredibly eloquently put question. Thank you for that. I think you've put your finger on precisely one of the things that I find to be really challenging, but also I think one of the kinds of possibilities of creative geography. So I think you're certainly in the kind of academic world I work in, there's everyone's very interested in doing creative geographies and being creative. It's a really, really good way of kind of making yourself quite distinct. It's a very good way of connecting with political groups. So, for example, Catherine's work, where she uses those photographs to give her research more power in big global bodies like the UN. But also, of course, she also uses it to work with communities. So I think it's an incredibly tense relationship, and one that needs a lot of thought. And I was particularly fascinated by the way that you kind of flipped that, if I understood rightly, and said, but how can creative practices help communities find academics? So how can it help us do those kinds of connections? I think one of the things that's been fascinating about work by people like Conferencia, who I noted, but also there's many others who've been working in this way, is what does it mean for academics like myself and like Conferencia, who are trained in a kind of Western art world context, to think about how creativity sits in relation to different sorts of communities' worldviews very differently. So, for example, the Pacific communities that Conferencia works with, sound is how they engage with the kinds of animals they hunt in the ocean. It's how they kind of live with that landscape. And so for them, what we would consider to be a kind of creative practice is part of how they are in the world. And so what's been very, very interesting has been watching how the communities and the collaborations that the academic research team and the communities have evolved together have really shifted and changed the way that as a geographer is thinking about kind of sounds and sound work and what that does, but has also provided a series of resources for the communities to then effectively kind of project their kinds of worldviews into different sorts of contexts. And I know that obviously Anne's not the only kind of artist who's making a lot of those connections. And there's very complex politics at stake here. And I'm sure many of you, especially those of you who've been working on Andreas's project, are very aware of how to kind of negotiate and navigate those tensions. And there's lots of different things that we could all learn differently, I think, from the kind of work that you've all been doing.
Sí, ya que lo comenta Harriet, también de paisajes sonoros hemos estado colaborando con equipos de sonidistas o capturadores de sonidos, como el grupo que tenemos acá en Valparaíso, que es Sonami. Ellos también tienen una captura de paisajes sonoros de lo que estamos celebrando en estos días, que es el estallido social político de Chile. Entonces también hay una relación ahí con la cultura, la política y la contingencia que se expresa en distintos sonidos. Y eso está muy claro en un aporte que tenemos de un colega, curiosamente viene de Bolivia, a capturar esto en video y en sonido, que es Oso, también está en nuestra página web. Quería dar la palabra a Fabián Araya, que está levantando la mano. Aquí lo estoy viendo. Por favor, Fabián.
Thank you very much, Harriet. Thank you, Andres, for your presentation, Harriet. Very interesting. In geographic education, Harriet, is very important the relationship between the literature and geography. What the possibilities for the integrate geography and literature in the GeoHumanities context?
Thank you. That's a really kind of fascinating and very important point. So I think the did I understand rightly, you were saying sort of literature, so the kinds of readings and kind of both in terms of kind of academic kinds of writings, but also in terms of kind of novels, plays. Have I understood that correctly? Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I think there's huge amounts of potential and lots of kind of fascinating kind of examples of work that's been going on within the GeoHumanities, obviously for a kind of number of years in terms of kind of analysing existing texts. But Sarah DeLeo's work is a really good example of kind of storytelling practices that have kind of grown from Indigenous contexts. But Sarah herself is also a published poet. There's also been some really fascinating examples of geographers working with very diverse kinds of writing practices. And I should also say that I'm calling a number of these individuals geographers, but perhaps they would also think of themselves as novelists, writers, and poets who've kind of come into geography in different sorts of ways. But there's an Irish geographer called Rob Kitchen, who has been doing a lot of he writes detective novels, for example. These are kind of popular novels. I don't know whether the sort of notion of literature would kind of, you know, when I think of the word literature, I kind of sometimes think of kind of the great canonical novels rather than necessarily kind of popular novels. But I think the kind of work that Rob does with detective novels is really fascinating. There's also been quite a lot to return, partly to the interesting question of the previous question around kind of the politics and community working. There's been some really interesting work that's also been thinking through the kind of potency and power of stories that travel. So Emil Cameron's work about the ways that stories of different sorts of different kinds of engagements between Indigenous and colonizing communities kind of became the stuff of myth that then circulated, and how it is that we can take those myths and sort of play with how story works and how story circulates is really fascinating. But I think if I can also address the other kind of perhaps angle on that kind of question around geography, literature, and the GeoHumanities, is also a kind of question about the continued importance of writing and words in a set of practices that can sometimes feel very much about performance and drama and dance and different kinds of practices. And obviously, as academics, we work in the context in which texts circulate. Having books and papers on our CVs often matters alongside some of these creative outputs. And I think one of the things I found really fascinating about the growth of the kind of creative practices within creative geography and the wider GeoHumanities has been both the commitment to shaping and pushing at what it is we mean by the idea of a monograph, for example. So Tim Cresswell wrote a book recently that's a sort of deep mapping of a place called Maxwell Street in Chicago, where he draws on Walter Benjamin's literary formats to create a non-linear account of the history of a place, which is a really fascinating way of playing with what language enables. But it's also a deeply scholarly and theoretical text that accords to an idea of a sort of body of literature that we would use as academics to evidence the importance of our ideas. So I think it's very intriguing to think through how there's a deep respect within a lot of these creative practices for the production of a kind of canon of disciplinary literature through which we can think critically about our ideas. And I also think that one of the things that's, I know you obviously said, mentioned the kind of educative aspect at the beginning of your question. And I think for a number of us, certainly, I don't know what you all do if you work with some of these kinds of ideas with some of your students, which I know the BioGeoArt project have lots of students attached to that. When we work with our students, we require them still to produce written outputs. So whether it's undergraduates who we teach these creative geographies as methods, they still have to write about the kind of methodology and the practice, all the way up through to the PhD, where if you do a practice-based PhD, 50% of your thesis is a creative output, but you also have to produce a body of writing that does the things that we would normally expect from the body of writing accompanying a PhD. So in my university, that's normally 100,000 words. An artist or a poet can produce an exhibition or a book of poetry, but then also has to write a kind of 50,000 word text that accompanies that. And within that text, they have to situate their practice in the literature, the sort of literature review of geography and the kind of classic disciplinary text we would expect to see. So it's quite a lot we demand, I think, in that context, a full knowledge of a discipline as well as practice. But I think that's perhaps what it also means to think through the sort of interdisciplinarity and what does it mean as well to make sure that creative geographies are legible to the whole discipline of geography in a way that, I have colleagues in my department who are physical geographers for whom if one of my students makes a performance, they love it, they think it's fascinating, but they're not entirely sure how it's geographical research. And I think what's different perhaps about doing performance as research within geography than in, say, drama, is that if you want geography as a discipline to understand it as research, there probably has to be some writing to enable that context so that everyone within the discipline can also access and understand that as a piece of geographic work. Does that answer your fascinating question somewhat?
Thank you very much, Harriet. Very much. Thank you.
¿Cómo estamos en la hora, Jorge? Tú me tienes que moderar aquí. Yo sé que en algún momento tenemos que cerrar el panel, pero estamos muy entusiasmados.
No, manéjalo tú. Sí, está
bueno,
muy
si les parece, podemos ir cerrando con algunas reflexiones. No sé si hay comentarios en el chat. Es realmente un trabajo que se profundiza. Estamos solamente observando la punta del iceberg de todos los temas que podríamos tratar y ir profundizando, ir trabajando la creatividad en una forma más sistemática, sobre todo como señalaban con estudiantes, ya sea con estudiantes de geografía o en el caso de Fabián con estudiantes de educación básica. Nosotros hemos realizado algunas experiencias, y disculpen que me alargue, con unos dispositivos en los cuales, también está en la página web, en los cuales quedan cubiertos los ojos y se aumenta la capacidad auditiva a través de unas especies de máscara. Y eso hemos escondido dispositivos en el bosque, de manera que hacemos ese juego de ir a buscar el sonido que está emergiendo de un pequeño dispositivo y de esa manera poder desarrollar la capacidad auditiva que muchas veces en adultos sobre todo ya está muy menoscabada, pero en los niños todavía está muy fresca y los ayudamos a redescubrir sensaciones que aparecen dormidas, sobre todo en en este aspecto también de los medios que nos tienen capturados con los teléfonos celulares, siempre mirando hacia abajo, y también es un aspecto de postura que tenemos que ir cambiando con los niños y en nosotros mismos también, de volver a mirar el paisaje con otros ojos, volver a escucharlo, volver a sentirlo. Recientemente nos invitaron a participar en un proyecto de contaminación lumínica, a ver si es que logramos elaborar un documento, un constructo, un proyecto para poder volver a mirar el cielo sin tener que carecer de esta experiencia. Y en ese sentido, retomando la palabra experiencia, también poder enfrentarnos a lo que el antropoceno, este concepto teórico del antropoceno, que nos dice que no hay nada que hacer prácticamente y muchas de las experiencias a las cuales estábamos acostumbrados se van a ir perdiendo. Entonces también es una lucha por recuperar y por evitar la extinción de la experiencia en el sentido del contacto con los seres cercanos y con los seres humanos y no humanos de nuestro entorno. Eso es un concepto clave que estamos trabajando, que es la extinción de la experiencia. Y cómo luchar o evitar esta extinción. Ahí se relaciona antropoceno, biopolítica, práctica creativa.
Hay una pregunta, Andrés, de Mariana Favila, sobre que ella estableció una relación con la arqueología, digamos. Entonces, ¿se puede dar algún ejemplo al respecto?
No sé, Mariana, si quieres expresar tu pregunta directamente.
Sure. Thank you, Harriet, for your amazing presentation. I was just wondering, because you mentioned the creative turn and how it also reached archaeology. I'm an archaeologist, which is trying to work close to geographers. So I'm really interested in if you could provide an example of this, please. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and I'm really excited to hear more about your own research. It would be lovely to kind of be able to have some of these kinds of exchanges. No, so there's been I don't know if you know, there's an archaeologist called basically there's a performance artist called basically a group of archaeology and performance artists have got together and developed something called theatre performance archaeology, and I can, if you want to email me, I can send you some links over, which is probably one of the better ways of doing it. And what they've been doing is trying to work through what it would mean to draw together the kind of histories and traditions of performance and performance art with the kind of reconstructive archaeologies of spaces. So kind of reconstructing kind of theatre, using kind of theatre practices to reconstruct the kind of histories of how spaces were used, but then also pushing that a bit further and thinking about examples around site-specific performance and documentary practices from performance art to think about what those might do to think about how archaeologists make knowledge. So there's been, I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it, sorry, it's the end of a very long day of teaching here. But if you email me, I can send you some examples. There was a special issue as well of an archaeology journal that was trying to explore the different ways this might work. And some of the different sorts of relationships were about kind of virtual reality kinds of recreation, so that kind of creativity. But then some of them are also much more about the ways that different sorts of artistic practices could also help to imagine different kinds of uses for sites that nothing was known about, as well as different sorts of engagement practices around, for example, there was a really interesting artist I was listening to talk the other day who'd been doing some work with forensic archaeologists about human remains and the unknown kinds of contexts of some sorts of human remains and the kinds of issues around dating some of them, and also the kinds of discussions of the ethical context in which those humans maybe died, and how you would engage local communities with some of those kinds of complexities around kind of stories of death, basically. So quite a range of different things as within geography, but I'm very happy to send you some references. So sorry for not being so articulate in answer to your wonderful question. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. If you could share actually your email, I would be very thankful.
Estaba sin el audio, Mariana.
Oh, I was just saying that if you could share her email, I could email her. Thank you. Great.
I just put it in a chat message to you so that you've got it if you want it. I look forward to talking to you.
Sure. Thank you.
Muy bien, entonces estamos llegando al final de esta conferencia magistral. No queremos abusar tampoco del tiempo de Harriet. Solamente una última frase. Harriet, habías nombrado a Alfred North Whitehead y todavía tenemos que hablar de filosofía y geografía, pero creo que va a quedar para otra conferencia. Solamente una frase de despedida, Harriet, que nos pudieses dejar y nosotros dejarte invitada para todo el tiempo cuando quieras volver a ilustrarnos con tus conocimientos y tus experiencias.
Well, thank you very much. And I should have remembered that you like to put people on the spot at the end of talks and ask them for some closing remarks, because it's a wonderful thing. I think I'm hoping that when the world has moved out of our current pandemic condition, we can all meet up and talk in person. I think rather than offering kind of any final words, I'd like to say I'm very excited and very inspired by the work that you've all been doing, and I'm really, really fascinated to see how we can ensure that GeoHumanities and creative geographies is something that we evolve together, learning from all the different disciplines and the different situations all of our different ways of doing geography around the world have. I think there's many, many things we can learn from each other, and I'm very excited about the possibility of creative geographies to make those horizontal and global links in ways that other aspects of our discipline perhaps sometimes don't. So it's been a real honor to talk to you. It's always so inspiring to engage with your work and the work of your community. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Harriet, por estar con nosotros. Y aprovechamos de invitarles a todos a la sesión de las 2:30 y también tenemos la sesión de videos en la tarde a las 6. Así es que hoy tenemos un largo día de geografías creativas y seguiremos también durante el congreso hasta el viernes con algunos temitas por aquí y por allá, trabajándolos en conjunto con los colegas aquí, con toda la comunidad geográfica de Chile y más allá. Así es que muchas gracias, Harriet. Un gran abrazo a digital, online, y la próxima vez nos veremos en persona. Un gran abrazo.